afternoon or good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our Learning and Knowledge Management webinar series. My name is Laia Greeno, and I manage Interaction's Evaluation and Program Effectiveness Working Group, which is organizing this series. With me today is also one of the two members of the EPE Working Group's Advisory Committee who serve as a point person for this priority area, and that's Haneen Malala from Oxfam America. I'll be letting you know what we have in store for you today in just a second, but before I do, I'll turn it over to Haneen so she could tell you a little bit more about this series. Go ahead, Haneen. It seems like we can't hear you, Haneen, so I'm just going to go ahead and take over this portion. So for those of you who joined us last month for our first webinar, the Evaluation and Program Effectiveness Working Group has organized this series to capture various organizations' approaches to learning and knowledge management. In our first webinar on May 21st, we heard about Mercy Corps' efforts to improve evaluation utilization and about the outcomes and evidence framework being developed by the International Rescue Committee. And materials from that webinar are available at the link that you see at the bottom of your screen. We're also already planning our third webinar, which will be in July, so stay tuned for news on that. We've confirmed the National Democratic Institute as one of our speakers and are working to confirm another organization. Planned for today, we have two great speakers from Catholic Relief Services and Lutheran World Relief. So with us from Catholic Relief Services is Guy Sherrick, who's Senior Advisor for Learning, and from Lutheran World Relief we have Garrett Sheeky, who's the M&E Technical Advisor. So Guy will be presenting on what CRS is doing to strengthen evaluative thinking, and Garrett on what LWR has learned from experimenting with 3 different learning approaches and platforms. So just a few words on how this session will go and then how you can pose questions. So we'll hear from our 2 presenters first, and then you'll be able to answer or to pose your questions. You can, if you want to minimize the little toolbox on the right-hand side of your screen, you can hit that orange arrow. You can view the presentation in the full screen mode by clicking on that blue box. And if you have a question, just type it in the question box. You can send your questions at any time, and then I'll pose them on your behalf when we get to the end of the webinar. You will be on mute, so posing a question in the question box is the only way you can ask a question. And then lastly, I'll just mention that we are planning to record this webinar, and we'll also be sharing the slides afterwards. So with that, Guy, I am going to turn it over to you.
Oh, thanks a lot, Maya. That's great. Let me just get this up here, show my screen. Can you see that, and can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can see it and hear you perfectly.
That's great. Thanks very much. And I noticed the timings you gave me, and I noticed that I get 1 more minute than Garrett. So thank you for favouring me in this particular case. Much appreciated. So hi everybody. Laia asked me to do a short presentation on work we've been doing related to learning. So I've chosen to say a few words on evaluative thinking. Spot the deliberate error. There's a slight change in the title, but I hope that doesn't change your interest in what I have to say. You'll notice that I've put in there Jane Buckley. I've been working with Jane at Cornell and Tom Archibald at Virginia Tech for the last 18 months to see if we can look more closely at this area and if and how evaluative thinking might contribute to the quality and effectiveness of CRS programming. So I guess a good obvious first question might be, what is evaluative thinking? And of course Michael Quinn Patton has something to say about it, as he does about most things relating to evaluation. And his words interestingly come from the preface to a report last year produced by Interaction following a workshop on evaluative thinking they co-facilitated in Ghana. Now in his comments, I like the way that he emphasises the need to embed evaluative thinking as a cost of doing development business, if you like, in all of our work. He talks specifically about evaluation, but I think we should understand this, and I don't think it's unreasonable to broaden it so that it incorporates all aspects of monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, or as we say in CRS, MEAL. Actually, there's a funny story associated with our MEAL acronym in that not so long ago we received a USAID issues letter questioning why we were spending so much on refreshments. Okay, here are a few more quotations about understanding what is evaluative thinking coming from different authors. Some keywords that are mentioned, you'll notice, focus on things like reflecting or reflective practice, testing assumptions, seeking evidence, and of course building evaluative thinking into our business practices. The definition that we currently use is one that will appear in an upcoming edition of the American Journal of Evaluation that Jane and Tom and others authored. I think evaluative thinking affords much greater profile, as you can see in this definition, to discovering assumptions that underpin our programming work. I think all too often in conventional logical frameworks, the assumptions column tends not to be given the respect that it deserves. The other point that I emphasize here in this evaluative thinking, it's not purely an intellectual activity. On the contrary, it's focused very much towards informing practical action. Now, where does it fit with monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning? When you look at the kinds of competencies required for good quality meal, I think evaluative thinking fits very well, and it fits throughout what we do. And as it happens in CRS, we've recently incorporated evaluative or critical thinking in our new set of competencies that we expect staff to have to undertake high quality meal. There in particular are the skills that I'm thinking that evaluative thinking brings to the table. So maybe a reasonable question to ask, well, aren't we already doing evaluative thinking in our work? And probably the answer in many cases is yes, but just to make sure, here are some ideas for what evaluative thinking, if done really well, could sound like. So you may hear people talking about, what do we assume, why are we assuming this particular thing? How do we know this? What evidence have we got for it? And so on and so forth. And also what it looks like. And I think some of the things that I've put in this column will look for evidence of more evidence gathering, more feedback from different directions. That word again, reflective conversations and practice. And a key motivator for me is the very last bullet in that right-hand column. And it's really the potential for all staff, at all levels in the food chain, if you like, who have evaluative thinking, knowledge and skills, to inform more meaningfully our ongoing programs. I find that the most motivating feature of evaluative thinking. Why do we have a hunch then in CRS that evaluative thinking may be important at this point in time and worth spending sort of time and effort on? Well, I think we're all aware that the way we've been doing business is changing across the development community, including those of us working in meal. There's a growing awareness that international and community development are inherently complex dynamic processes, and that the tools we use for meal really do need to reflect this. And you'll see where the stars are in that little quadrant diagram. Really, the evaluative thinking, in my view, appears all over monitoring, accountability, evaluation and learning. So it's applicable to every aspect of the work we do. The kind of development and humanitarian work that we undertake, often engaged in social transformation, requires more adaptive approaches to programming and an approach to meal that encourages and responds, through shorter learning and response cycles, to the emergence of solutions co-created with our beneficiaries. Some of you may have heard of the Cunevin framework, and it sort of offers a kind of theoretical underpinning for notions of complexity and the emergent practices that arise in response to our interventions. Evaluative thinking supports ongoing reflection and learning, and thereby enables the emergence of co-created adaptive practices. And in so doing, I think evaluative thinking helps us to minimize risks associated with relying on our assumptions and improves our work more efficiently in order to make a bigger impact. I mean, anyone can do evaluative thinking, I believe, but it's not a trivial exercise in building capacity here and changing organisational culture. And I do think it requires habitual practice. It does require a safe space to enable people to question and identify assumptions and make suggestions. But a key thing here I've found is starting with smaller changes and look in the future to sort of ramping up. We can't change an organisation overnight in this regard. So I firmly believe that all staff can think evaluatively. I mean, they do in the real world, so why not at work? My experience to date that encouraging evaluative thinking in the workplace requires intentionality. It doesn't just happen, at least not from an organisational perspective. The growing interest in and attention to theory of change is exceedingly timely. Theory of change provides a valuable starting point for a lot of what we've been doing in CRS around evaluative thinking. Having a theory of change, whether it's project or sector or whatever level, helps staff to identify and validate assumptions, or miracles as the cartoon suggests, that might otherwise have remained hidden or unchecked. We've come up with a simple acronym, ACT, to capture the basic process of evaluative thinking that you can see there. And staff I've worked with are often amazed when they start to discover assumptions that underpin their own thinking. So evaluative thinking provides a conceptual approach and rationale for staff to ask questions of their colleagues about the assumptions that underpin so much of our programs. And you can see the kinds of questions that they might ask in the slide in front of you. Encouraging multiple perspectives here is critical, and I think this is a key challenge, at least that's what I've found in our experience, though not insoluble in an organisational setting. Somebody called Margaret Heffernan says that we need thinking partners who are not echo chambers, and she suggests that we should dare to disagree. For good ideas and true innovation, she says, you need human interaction, conflict, argument, and debate, and that doesn't necessarily come easy, certainly in the CRS culture, to a lot of people. So it requires thinking about and introducing slowly, but deliberately and purposefully. The last few slides I want to present is ideas for promoting evaluative thinking, if this is something that interests you in your agency. First one is being able to present the business case for investing in evaluative thinking is important. We've been collecting quantitative and qualitative data in order to be able to, in time, to present evidence to suggest, hopefully, that investing in evaluative thinking can make a difference. We're currently using, some of you may be familiar with Kirkpatrick's 4-level model for evaluating capacity strengthening. Creating an enabling environment that supports learning, including evaluative thinking, is really key here, and capacity strengthening is alone clearly insufficient. The problem is we always say this, but we do little to effect it, and herein lies the challenge, but one that we're now turning our attention to in a couple of sites that we're working, notably in Ethiopia and in Zambia. And the question is, how can we ensure an enabling environment exists for reflective practice? What positive role can internal leadership have in encouraging evaluative thinking, and how can we affect this? I suspect there are many changes to this change management process, and we're just starting out on this particular road. Team meetings are clearly an important opportunity to look to see how to build in and incorporate evaluative thinking approaches. There are chances, obviously, where you can review progress and learning plans and determine the need for further investigation. Now, in one of our projects, the Zambia Feed the Future project, we have, like in most projects, a good structure for meetings. We have monthly meetings that focus on logistics, sort of basic single loop learning. We have regular quarterly learning meetings, which is an initial opportunity, if you like, for double loop learning, focusing on qualitative and quantitative evidence of observations of the staff, their reports, their field visits, and so on and so forth. And annual learning reflections, and this is really, again, double loop learning, but a deeper dive. It usually takes place over a week, and it allows a much greater sort of reflective activity. In that same project, we've been using checklists to ensure that evaluative thinking approaches are embedded in our day-to-day project business, such as these meetings. And for anybody who's interested, there's an excellent book, if you've not already come across it, by an American oncologist, as it happens, called Atul Gawande, entitled The Checklist Manifesto, and I found that really quite inspirational, I have to say. Another area I would suggest is simplifying reporting forms for field staff that focus on learning and adapting, based around conversations that staff have with community members. I think this balancing of standard performance monitoring with a space for reflection and learning is an important consideration. In this instance, in Zambia, the US Aid Mission has been very supportive of our attempts to balance the need for standard performance data and carving out space for more reflective questioning and learning. And I think it's true to say both parties are learning how to make space for, in the US Aid framework, collaborating, learning and adapting, for making space for that kind of work on the ground. Diagramming enables greater involvement and transparency. It's harder to hide assumptions when there is, in effect, a bright light being shone on the thinking that underpins a project. It enables staff to be open to questioning, to surfacing various perspectives and plausible alternatives to conventional thinking. I think evaluative thinking requires trust-based, safe communication among all staff and beneficiaries and supervisors and other stakeholders. This isn't always easy and does require trust and practice, but it's critical. And I think we've found that two major inhibitors are, firstly, that individuals are wary of having opinions that differ from those to whom they report, and secondly, individuals have to learn how to take and accept constructive criticism. Almost at the end now, CRS uses learning to action discussions where we encourage staff at different levels to engage with quantitative and qualitative data through a series of prompt questions. And although this approach has been around since Smiler first came out, it's taken a while to get off the ground and more work is needed. Nonetheless, there has been a growing interest in it as the discussion around adaptive management has gathered momentum. Based on the theory of change, learning agenda planning has been helpful to address issues as they've presented themselves as projects are implemented, and such plans emphasise the importance of including easy-to-do actions, not necessarily requiring formal surveys. My final thoughts is listed here, really. Start small. Initial steps into evaluative thinking and learning should really be fit into your existing meal system. Identify champions, I think that's a sort of fairly standard thing, but people and projects need support from the top and the bottom to build a culture of learning and evaluative thinking. To question is not the same as criticizing, and learning is about figuring out the why, not about right and wrong, and that's an important message to get across to people, and it takes time. Be comfortable in the unknown, as difficult as it may be, and it is difficult when you're brought up on a diet of standard performance monitoring and targets. It's important to encourage colleagues to suspend the rush to an easy conclusion when data are presented. And the last thing, of course, is keep it simple. Tempting to overthink every little problem or possibility is probably not a good idea. The key thing, and this is where the theory of change comes in, is focus on the key issues, the sticky issues, where if you do understand them better, you can really make ground in your theory of change. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Guy. And now I'll turn it over to Garrett to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So Garrett, I just made you the presenter.
Great, thank you very much, Laia, and thank you, Haneen, and thank you for the participants online as well, and thank you for Guy's presentation. I think that all of this is very useful, and it relates to the context that LWR has been working in. And in fact, you're going to see a lot of this evaluative thinking in the context within the practical examples that I'm going to present. So I wanted to give a quick outline. 1 second. Of Lutheran World Relief. I wanted to give everyone a general idea of the size of Lutheran World Relief because I think it influences the learning approaches that an organization takes. LWR is a medium-sized NGO with about 200 staff in 16 countries. We focus primarily on agriculture, climate change, and emergency response. In terms of monitoring and evaluation and learning, LWR is a relatively young organization. We've had monitoring and evaluation and learning for about 4 years, and only for about 3 years have we really integrated DMEL, design, monitoring, evaluation, learning systems into all of our projects. I think that this provided us an opportunity as well as a challenge in terms of learning. You heard Guy mention that change can't take place in terms of a learning culture overnight, but we really almost had a blank slate to introduce new approaches. But in that same sense, we also had limited human resources to see some of the approaches that we took through to the end. So I wanted to couch all of these experiences before presenting them in this concept of why did they possibly succeed and why didn't they succeed? And a lot of that came down to relevance. And although relevance is nothing new, I think it's still very important when looking at what kind of forums or activities an organization will undertake to encourage learning and knowledge sharing. I think one thing that's really important is that whatever context you're in, you need to define relevance. And you need to define relevance to what? For this presentation, I'm taking a fairly broad interpretation of relevance and even going to the point where identifying obstacles to the use of information is relevant to relevance. Because if there are obstacles, then staff will, the users of the information or project staff will be less inclined to view the content that's being shared as relevant to their particular context. When defining relevance to what, we need to think about are we defining it to their interests, to technical areas, to job responsibilities? It'll help us focus better the approach and the content that's presented in each one of these kind of forums or activities. I think that there's another key thing to think about when thinking about relevance, the concept of nice to know versus need to know. For example, it's nice to know what the weather is. You don't want to be walking outside in the middle of a rainstorm. But then again, it's not going to ruin everyone's day. You can perfectly go out and walk your dog in a rainy day and enjoy it. And then there's the need to know information. If your house is burning down, it's probably going to be something that you want to know. I think this concept of need to know versus nice to know is directly related to relevance. Oftentimes, the nice to know information is less relevant to direct job responsibilities, and oftentimes you see the enthusiasm is coming from select individuals with high interest in the topic or content of that conversation. As for the need to know information, I think that it's oftentimes more directly relevant to the job responsibilities, but there can be less enthusiasm for the content because it's required. A few factors that influences relevance, and you can actually look at these as factors or obstacles. The ease of access to information influences the relevance to the users. If the information is difficult to access, then the perceived relevance will go down. Furthermore, timeliness of the information, untimely information, reduces the relevance to the user. There also is, we need to look at the time needed versus dedicated to digest the information. If you have a small amount of time to digest a lot of information, then the relevance is also going to go down. One topic that continually comes up in our line of work is the language. We have to oftentimes overcome language barriers, and if you can't overcome those language barriers, then obviously the relevance of the information is going to be reduced. And then finally, when we think about activities or forums where the knowledge or learning is being presented, I think that a sense of belonging or inclusion in the group is a key determinant in relevance. If you feel like the information that's being presented or the style of the presentation of the information is not creating a sense of belonging, then you're going to view the relevance of the information as reduced. So 3 practical examples. We thought that it's always good to understand how some of these concepts of evaluative thinking or learning or knowledge management and knowledge sharing are actually implemented in organizations. Within the last 2 or 3 years, LWR has undertaken 3 interesting approaches to learning. One of them is a project reflection session. A second one was a Yammer forum, and the third one was a project spotlight. So the first one, project reflection sessions. So as I said, we integrated a new design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework into all of our projects about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago. So it gave us the opportunity to say throughout the project management cycle, where can we most influence how people are actually using data for decision making, which I think is really important. And so with project reflection sessions, we actually said on a quarterly basis, you should dedicate time and resources to getting key staff members and project participants together to reflect upon the data that they've been collecting through the monitoring and evaluation system. So one of the key ways that we did that is that there is oftentimes a focus on quantitative indicators, and we wanted to give them the opportunity to use quantitative data as a milestone or a starting point for truly understanding what that quantitative data means for the impact of the project or the progress of the project. And so taking their quantitative data and really doing a deep dive about what it means for the overall success of the project. It was in terms of how relevant were these project reflection sessions. If we're thinking about it from a job description perspective, they're quite relevant. We actually designed them so the project reflection sessions would create content for the project progress report. So we said, if you sit down as staff for a half a day or a day and reflect on this information, if you do it in this process, then you'll actually have all the content for your project progress report. Oftentimes project progress reports are done by one person in a room, and it's difficult, and the content is not necessarily deep or illuminating to achieving our results. And so we said, undertake this session and you can finish all of your work for the project progress report. Also, it's done in a local language, so these are done at the project level, and so you're not having to worry about translation necessarily. And finally, we encourage them to be budgeted, both in terms of time and resources. So to bring our partners and participants together, and then also to have the time to do that on a quarterly basis. In terms of the Yammer forum, we saw that there was different desires for sharing of content and information across the organization. And at the organizational level, we thought that people really expressed the desire to understand what's going on across regions. And so we really said, this is possibly an issue in terms of a platform. And so we did a lot of pilots of several different platforms, including LinkedIn, Facebook, and Yammer, which Yammer is what is called an enterprise social network. And enterprise social networking is basically like Facebook, but oriented towards more kind of business functions and business interactions, so groups for information sharing. The Yammer forum was created and it experienced success at first, but it was primarily in English. And so it was difficult for some of our French-speaking countries and also our Spanish-speaking countries to fully interact within this Yammer forum. It ended up being HQ, headquarters heavy, in terms of its use and content, even though field staff were invited and were really encouraged to participate. And finally, it didn't really reach a level of self-reinforcing use to pull staff in. And so certain staff would participate more, but we didn't really reach a point where it was pulling staff in because of the content that was being presented. And so at this point in time, there's comparatively low use of the platform. And then the final approach that I'm going to present on is this concept of project spotlights. And so we knew that we had many projects that were out there that were in different regions that were looking to do very similar things. And there wasn't a lot of understanding amongst the regions of what was going on in the other regions. And so we actually used the Yammer forum to undertake Project Spotlights. And Project Spotlight was a presentation by a program manager for a specific project, and we actually promoted it well in advance, and then he or she had 2 days to actually use a Yammer group to present photos and information on the project, and to be available to answer questions to all the staff who were participating in the Project Spotlight. It was very good for learning between countries and regions. The local language was a bit of a problem because in Latin America, the sessions were presented in Spanish. We encouraged the use of Google Translate functions through Chrome, but we're not sure how well that was taken. And so oftentimes, participation was really focused on a regional level across countries rather than across regions. It's not used now, although we did get positive feedback. We just didn't really have anyone to take ownership of these Project Spotlights after the pilots had been conducted. So I wanted to really look at each approach and its success, and how is that related to the relevance to the job responsibilities of the people who were participating, and also this need to know, nice to know spectrum. So the project reflection sessions have been the most sustainable and probably the most integrated into our everyday work. And some of the reason why is because the relevance of the information that was being used and shared was high, and also it was need to know. This is for decision making, for management, and for understanding the success of the projects. Whereas the Project Spotlights, the relevance was really kind of in the middle scale, and it was nice to know information. And finally, the Yammer forum has been probably the least successful. The relevance is not real high in terms of job responsibilities, and it is also nice to know information. So given that, what's next? Now we definitely are continuing to double down on some of these things that we've done in the past, in particular the reflection meetings. I think that we need to do more work on facilitation techniques, and also thinking about the importance of evaluative thinking, as Guy mentioned, but also the importance of data for decision making. We haven't totally abandoned Yammer and Project Spotlights, but I think that now is the time for LWR to try to resurrect them and figure out how to make them work, using this framework of relevance and trying to respond to the relevance of particular groups. We've also been working very hard on trying to package report content that we have to respond to specific audiences. So that's a little bit outside of this group participation in learning and knowledge sharing, but it's also something that's very important within the organization. And in the future, I've been thinking a lot about how do we create more need-to-know context. Maybe it's not necessarily linked to job descriptions, but need-to-know seems to encourage more participation. We've also thought of identifying learning cohorts, so understanding the interest in needs of people throughout the organization and grouping them so that the content that's presented within a particular forum or approach is more relevant to their needs. And finally, we've contemplated the idea of replacing the idea of a champion with the idea of an information weaver. It's really crucial in each one of these forums we found that it was crucial to have a person who really understands the relevance of the information to the group, and to be able to weave that information to other individuals within that forum to increase participation overall. And without that, the forums tend to kind of peter out. So that's basically the experience of Lutheran World Relief in short. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Garrett. So now we have a few minutes for Q&A. I have a couple of questions lined up, but if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the question box, and I'll pose it on your behalf. So a couple of questions for Garrett to start. First, could you just explain the Yammer forum a bit more, its functionalities and how it's used? And then a second question for you as well from someone at the Red Cross, asking, the reflection sessions sound very interesting. Would you be able to share any guiding questions for those sessions and the report format for documenting it? They're also reviewing their quarterly report format right now, and that would be really useful to refer to.
Yeah, absolutely. The Yammer forum, you can actually go. It's yammer.com. I think it was recently purchased by Microsoft, and so they're trying to do some integration with some of their other products. But the Yammer forum is really, you can create groups, you can tag people, you can encourage people, you can post polls, and so it's very, very similar to Facebook, but it keeps functionality and learning within the organization, and is also more kind of business oriented. So we looked at several different options, like I said, including LinkedIn and Facebook, but we decided to go against Facebook just because I think our staff were concerned with this mix between kind of personal and professional. And so Yammer became, its structure is very similar to Facebook, and so I think that that ultimately was a good option. I think that it takes a lot of facilitation. It takes someone that's very dedicated to overseeing it and making sure that people are participating. And then looking at a paid versus a free version, you can get free versions of it, but what we found was very difficult was to know who was participating. You could obviously see who was participating actively, but who was not, who was actually just lurking, is what we call them, actually looking at the information, maybe finding things useful about the information, but not knowing that because we don't have the statistics for it. And the statistics would be, or the metrics for it is available through the paid version, but we just never, to this point, have found that we wanted to actually take the plunge and buy the paid version in order to try to push the platform forward. In terms of the project, the reflection meetings, yes, all of our documents for the design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework are available at dmel.lwr.org. And so we have a kind of very simple outline for going through and thinking about your quantitative data and digging into what is the meaning of the quantitative data. So that's there, and then our reporting template is also up there. We're going through, the reporting template has been a constant struggle because we've had a huge focus on activities, and we wanted to orient people towards thinking about results and assumptions and unidentified or unintended outcomes. And so trying to link that together has been tricky, and I don't think we've necessarily found the kind of the key to the perfect progress report, but I think that we're getting there, and soon, by this fall, we're actually going to be rolling out a phase 2 of our DMEL framework with some updated tools and documents, so keep an eye out for those as well.
Thanks, Garrett. I think this question could go to either one of you. So this is a question from Marissa at the Hunger Project, and she would like to know what methods you've been using to document or share the learning across projects and throughout the organization. They're interested in not only learning in the moment, but documenting that information for future learning.
I can say a couple of words on that if you like. Well, certainly in CRS we have can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, just in CRS, I mean, I guess our key sort of knowledge sharing platform is a SharePoint site, which has been, I should say, probably an understatement has been sort of problematic over a long period of time, but is gradually sort of, I think it's this cultural thing as people start to use it. So that's been a prime focus for knowledge sharing. We're also using software which is based on, it's called the Gateway, and it's based on Salesforce software. And again, that's going to be, if you like, our first stab really at a more integrative system for sharing information around projects. So there'll be a complementary thing. Now, I think the interesting thing to think about here, and I was particularly interested in Garrett's presentation about reflections and the things he was saying about Yammer and so on, is I recently read a blog where the headline, if you like, was if you have to make a choice between codifying knowledge, which is, if you like, one strategy for knowledge management, where you essentially try to document everything and make it available that way. If you have a choice to make between codifying knowledge and connecting people, choose the latter. And I thought it was quite a sort of a startling statement. And the argument being is that codification of knowledge is good to an extent, but it tends to just generate information, and it's the connecting people where you really get the rich interaction. And the arguments are that he says is that through dialogue, obviously you get more nuanced exchange of information and knowledge, really sort of that enables you to address the challenge of context that's more likely to occur in those kind of contexts, and you wouldn't get that so easily with codified knowledge. And secondly, connecting people doesn't just help one person to answer their particular question, but it encourages the emergence of ideas that may be new to both colleagues, and I think that's an interesting one. And the last thing is it clearly builds relationships that strengthen knowledge sharing and learning. So I think that's an interesting one, and in a sense reflects the other key strategy for an agency, I think, thinking about knowledge sharing is either this or some balance between the codification of knowledge and the personalization of these kind of connections. Thanks. Good question.
No, thanks, Guy. And your comments actually remind me of the first webinar where Mercy Corps presented, and something they mentioned was really crucial for encouraging use of evaluation they found was sort of social capital. So people do rely, one of the main ways people access knowledge is by talking to others. So what you've just said sort of reinforces that point.
I think so. I think often underestimate sort of learning as a social process, and people tend to, I think, well, maybe I'm just talking about CRS, but certainly in CRS, I don't think we give enough credit for things like learning exchange visits and so on, and conversations around the water cooler. There's a huge amount of learning going. How you manage that as an agency, I think, is the challenge. What you do with that, and I think it's an issue. It's not an either or. You need codified knowledge, but you mustn't, in the process of doing that, crowd out and squeeze out attempts to encourage social processing of learning. In fact, they should be greatly encouraged. If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to share the blog, which is written by a guy, some of you may have come across his name before, Bruce Britton, who wrote a very good paper quite a few years ago called The Learning NGO. Thanks.
No, that would be great. And Guy, actually, if you could send me those resources, that would be wonderful, and I'll make sure everyone attending this webinar has access to them. Maybe one last question for you guys, since we're coming close to the end of time, and if you have a burning question, please do pose it in the question box. But you spoke a lot in your presentation about the importance of creating an enabling environment for evaluative thinking, and so I was wondering if you could just briefly mention some of the specific things you've tried to create that in your Zambia and Ethiopia offices.
I think it's a really good question, and I think it really is the key to things. I think sometimes in monitoring and evaluation, we tend to get a bit obsessed with the tools and the instruments we use, and that's fine, that's all well and good. We need good tools, we need good instruments. And I'm guilty of this as much as anybody, I think. There's a tendency to forget, actually, these need to be used within a particular environment. So what I found, in a sense, I don't know if I deliberately did this. I suppose within CRS, I've found often a way to sort of achieve change in the first instance is to identify those country programs, those projects where there seems to be real receptivity to the ideas that you're trying to encourage. And then over time, others, when they see things working and see things changing for the better, will want a piece of the action. Now, in the case of Zambia, we've been really fortuitous in that the enabling environment has had a donor, in other words, the USA mission in this case, which I think has been remarkably open to trying and allowing us to try new ways of managing and reporting on the project. And they've been comfortable because they trust the chief of party. There's a really, really good relationship between the chief of party of that particular project and the USAID mission. So relationship building is fundamental here, the level of trust. And that's enabled the chief of party, if you like, to carve out space for learning and reflection that I think is different from a lot of projects that I've seen where there's more focus, if you like, on the sort of standard performance monitoring. Of course, there's some of that there, but this is, I think, a key part of this is really the leadership of a project or a country program, whatever level you're working at, just sets a tone and then can enable an environment that is conducive for reflection and learning. We've got a long way to go on this, don't get me wrong, so I'm only pointing to one or two instances here. But I think this is really a crux point for significant changes around monitoring and evaluation, and particularly in this era that we're moving into of complexity and adaptive management.
Well, thanks very much, Guy. We're at the end of time. Just to rapidly conclude, just wanted to again let you know that the resources from these webinars are being posted on Interaction's website. As you can see here, if you go to www.interaction.org/work/monitoring-evaluation, you'll find the presentations from the first webinar. I'll be posting the presentations from this webinar shortly thereafter. And if you're interested in the Interaction's Evaluative Thinking publication that Guy mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, that's also available there. So thank you again, Guy and Garrett, so much for presenting, and thank you all for joining as participants in this webinar.
Thanks very much, Lana.
Thank you.